Spring of 1900. A crew of sponge divers from the island of Simi is sailing toward the coast of North Africa when a storm forces them to change course. They pull in near a small, mostly empty island in the Aegean called Antikythera and wait for the weather to clear. Sponge diving was the family trade in these waters, and with nothing else to do, some of the crew decide to dive anyway, scanning the seabed for sponges while they wait out the wind. What one of them finds instead is not sponges. It is a shipwreck, sitting roughly 45 meters down, scattered across the seafloor between Crete and the Greek mainland. One diver later described what he saw as a heap of dead, naked bodies. It was marble statues, arms and torsos lying in the silt, exactly where the ship had gone down almost 2,000 years earlier. The divers surfaced, reported what they had found, and by November the captain had informed Greek officials. The Greek Navy sent ships to support a full excavation, and recovery work continued into 1901 and 1902. The divers worked in primitive canvas suits and heavy bronze helmets, limited to roughly 5 minutes on the bottom before they had to come back up. It was slow, dangerous, unglamorous work, hauling up bronze statues, glassware, jewelry, and coins from a Roman-era cargo ship that had apparently been carrying looted Greek treasure west, possibly from the island of Rhodes toward Rome, when it sank around 60 BCE. Among the haul was a shapeless, corroded lump of bronze and wood, roughly the size of a shoebox. Compared to the statues, it was unremarkable. Nobody photographed it first. Nobody wrote excited letters about it. It sat in storage, catalogued alongside hundreds of other artifacts, while the marble figures took the spotlight in Athens. Then, months later, the lump cracked. As the wood casing dried out and crumbled, something underneath caught the light. Gear teeth. Precisely cut, interlocking bronze gear teeth. The kind of thing nobody expected to find inside a 2,000-year-old shipwreck, because nothing like it was supposed to exist yet. That single object would eventually force historians to rewrite what they thought the ancient world was capable of building. Scientists would spend more than a century arguing about what was inside it, what it calculated, and how a civilization without electricity, without precision machine tools, without anything we would recognize as industrial manufacturing, managed to build a device this exact. Today, only 82 fragments survive, representing an estimated 1/3 of the original mechanism, and every one of those fragments has been fought over by scholars for generations. This chapter is about how a piece of decorative-looking scrap almost got filed away and forgotten, and why it didn't. Here is the question that actually matters, and it is not, what is this object? Archaeologists eventually answered that. The harder question is why it took modern science more than 100 years, multiple generations of scholars, feuding research teams, and eventually industrial X-ray equipment originally designed for entirely different purposes, just to understand what a Greek craftsman had already figured out roughly 2,150 years ago. And there's a second question underneath that one, and it's the one that keeps historians up at night. If the ancient Greeks had the knowledge and the skill to build this, why does nothing else like it survive? Not a similar device, not a simpler prototype, not even a written description detailed enough to reconstruct one. One object, alone, pulled out of the sea by accident, representing a level of mechanical sophistication that doesn't show up again in the historical record for well over 1,000 years. That gap is the real mystery here, more than the mechanism itself. Somewhere between the workshop that built this thing and the wreck that sank with it on board, an entire branch of ancient engineering seems to have gone quiet. The answer to how we finally understood the device involves shipwrecks, seafloor archaeology, rival scientists building competing theories decades apart, a laminography technique borrowed from unrelated engineering fields, and finally, a piece of custom-built industrial scanning equipment that let researchers see three-dimensionally inside solid corroded bronze for the first time. We'll get to all of it. But first, it helps to understand exactly how much the ancient world needed something like this in the first place. Before mechanical clocks, before printed calendars, before anything resembling modern timekeeping, ancient societies depended entirely on the sky to organize their lives. Farmers needed to know when to plant and when to harvest. Religious festivals were pinned to specific phases of the moon. Entire civic calendars shifted depending on solar and lunar cycles that didn't line up neatly with each other, which created constant friction between the practical need for a fixed calendar and the physical reality of an irregular sky. The Babylonians had been tracking eclipses and lunar cycles for centuries before the Antikythera Mechanism was built, compiling detailed observational records that let them predict recurring patterns mathematically, without necessarily understanding why those patterns existed. Greek astronomers inherited and built on that foundation. Figures like Hipparchus, working in the 2nd century BCE, refined models of the sun and moon's motion with a level of mathematical precision that still impresses historians of science today. Poseidonios, a Greek philosopher and astronomer active around the same era, is directly connected to this story, since ancient writers described mechanical devices associated with his circle that sound remarkably similar to what was found in the wreck. All of this knowledge, though, lived primarily in written tables and oral instruction. Predicting an eclipse or tracking the 19-year Metonic cycle, the period after which lunar phases realign with the same calendar dates, meant working through layers of arithmetic by hand, referencing tables that had to be copied and recopied without error across generations. Now consider the actual scale of the technological gap this device represents. Nothing of comparable mechanical complexity, meaning a geared machine that performs calculations automatically through interlocking mechanical parts rather than through human arithmetic, appears anywhere else in the surviving historical record for roughly the next 1,400 years. The next devices approaching this level of sophistication are European mechanical astronomical clocks, built starting in the 14th century. That is not a small gap. That is over a millennium of apparent silence between one civilization quietly solving a problem in bronze and anyone else attempting something similar again. This single shoebox-sized object is the only surviving proof that the gap wasn't always there. Let's go back to the wreck itself, because the details matter more than the summary suggests. The ship that sank off Antikythera was Roman, but its cargo tells a specifically Greek story. Coin evidence recovered from the site has been dated to a narrow window, roughly between 70 and 62 BCE, which helps pin down when the ship most likely went down, somewhere around 60 BCE. The cargo included bronze and marble statuary, fine glassware, jewelry, and pottery, the kind of haul consistent with a Roman vessel transporting looted or purchased Greek art westward, quite possibly from the island of Rhodes, a major center of Hellenistic science and craftsmanship, toward Rome or somewhere in Italy. The excavation itself, conducted across the winter of 1900 into 1901, and continuing with support in 1902, was primitive by any modern standard. Divers wore heavy canvas suits and bronze helmets fed by surface airlines, descending to a wreck sitting between roughly 40 and 50 meters down, a depth that pushed the safe limits of the diving technology available at the time. Each dive lasted only a handful of minutes before the risk of decompression sickness forced a return to the surface. Despite those constraints, the recovery effort brought up an extraordinary haul, one of the richest single shipwreck excavations in the history of archaeology up to that point. The corroded bronze fragment that would eventually become known as the Antikythera Mechanism didn't stand out during the initial cataloging. It looked like a lump of decayed metal and wood, unremarkable next to detailed marble statues. It sat largely unexamined until the wooden casing surrounding it began to dry and crumble, revealing the gear teeth underneath. That moment, a crumbling wood fragment falling away to expose precision-cut bronze, is really the true starting point of over a century of scientific obsession. What survives today is fragmentary and incomplete. 82 individual fragments have been identified and studied, and researchers estimate that this represents only around 1/3 of the mechanism's original material. The rest was likely lost to corrosion, to the original recovery process, or remains scattered on the seafloor in a wreck that still has not been fully excavated more than a century later. Those 82 fragments are now preserved at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, and nearly everything we know about how the device worked has had to be painstakingly reconstructed from that partial, damaged evidence. For the first several decades after its discovery, The mechanism sat as a puzzle nobody could fully solve. That changed with Derek de Sola Price, a historian of science who became fixated on the fragments and dedicated an enormous portion of his career to understanding them. Working with Charalambos Karakalos, a radiographer at Greece's Demokritos Research Center, Price used conventional X-ray imaging, a technology far less capable than what would come decades later, to try to peer inside the corroded bronze without destroying it. This was slow, uncertain work. Conventional X-rays essentially flatten a three-dimensional object into a two-dimensional image, which meant Price was often trying to infer the position and depth of overlapping gears from shadowy, ambiguous pictures. He pursued this research for more than 30 years. In 1959, he published a piece in Scientific American making the striking claim that this device might represent the world's first analog computer, built roughly 2,000 years before anything comparable. In 1974, he published his major life's work, a detailed monograph titled Gears from the Greeks, laying out his full theory of how the mechanism's gear train was structured and what it calculated. Price deserves enormous credit here. He was the first person to seriously argue, with real technical analysis behind him, that this device was a functioning astronomical calculator rather than some kind of decorative or ceremonial object. He got the big picture right decades before anyone had the tools to prove it conclusively. But here's the honest part of this story, the part that doesn't get told as often. Later research, using far more advanced imaging in the 2000s, revealed that significant portions of Price's specific gear train reconstruction were incorrect. He had the concept right. Many of the mechanical details, how specific gears connected, how many teeth certain wheels actually had, were wrong, simply because the imaging technology of his era couldn't give him a clear enough picture to get them right. There's something almost poetic and a little sad about that. A man spends more than 30 years of his working life staring into a bronze puzzle box, publishes the theory that finally convinces the world this thing is a real scientific instrument, and still dies without ever actually seeing, clearly, what was inside it. The box kept fighting back against being understood, even against someone who gave it 3 decades of his life. The next major leap forward came from Michael Wright, working alongside a computer scientist named Alan Bromley. Where Price had been limited to conventional X-rays, essentially flat shadow images, Wright and Bromley applied a technique called X-ray laminography. Instead of producing a single flattened picture, laminography lets researchers effectively slice through an object in layers, isolating one depth plane at a time and filtering out the visual noise from everything above and below it. For a corroded lump packed with overlapping gears sitting just millimeters apart, this was a genuine breakthrough, the mechanical equivalent of finally being able to read one page of a book without the ink from every other page bleeding through. What Wright found rewrote major parts of Price's original theory. He determined that the 2 large dials on the back of the mechanism were not simple circles, as Price had assumed, but spirals, wound through multiple turns to fit a long astronomical cycle into a compact space. He also worked out the function of what's called the pin and slot mechanism, a small but ingenious pairing of 2 gears mounted slightly off-center from each other, connected by a pin riding inside a slot. As the first gear rotates at a constant speed, the pin drags the second gear faster or slower, depending on where in its slot it sits, which lets the whole assembly reproduce the moon's genuinely irregular motion across the sky, speeding up and slowing down exactly as it does in reality. In modern terms, this is a mechanical model of what we'd now describe using Kepler's second law of planetary motion, built and functioning in bronze roughly 1,700 years before Kepler was born. The physical precision involved here is worth sitting with for a second. Gear teeth on the mechanism were hand-cut at roughly 1 millimeter in length. That is not machine tool precision by modern standards, but it is remarkably exact work to produce by hand, repeatedly, across dozens of interlocking wheels, using nothing but Hellenistic-era metalworking tools. This chapter also carries a quieter, harder note. Alan Bromley died in 2002, before the bulk of their laminography data had been fully published, and a significant portion of that data had traveled with him to Australia years earlier during his own research. Wright was left to carry the project forward largely alone. He spent the following years publishing a steady run of technical papers, correcting details, refining the gear train model, and eventually hand-building extraordinarily accurate bronze-working replicas of the mechanism based on his findings. It's a pattern that repeats throughout this story. Progress here has never come easily, and it has rarely come from one person working uninterrupted. Every advance was built on someone else's incomplete work, often after that person was no longer able to finish it themselves. By 2005, the fragments had been studied for over a century, and two major independent reconstructions existed, Price's and Wright's, disagreeing with each other on significant mechanical details. What the field needed wasn't another scholar staring harder at old X-rays. It needed fundamentally better imaging technology, and in September of 2005, it got it. A collaboration formed between researchers at Cardiff University, the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, the University of Thessaloniki, and Tony Freeth's firm, Images First, working together as the Antikythera Mechanism research project, led by Freeth and physicist Mike Edmonds. Rather than adapting existing medical or industrial scanners, the project commissioned X-Tech Systems, a UK engineering firm, to build a custom high-power microfocus X-ray computed tomography system specifically capable of handling the awkward size, density, and fragility of the corroded bronze fragments. Funding for transporting this specialized equipment to Greece came through the Leverhulme Trust. Alongside the CT work, Hewlett-Packard contributed a separate imaging technique called polynomial texture mapping, which uses controlled raking light from multiple angles to capture microscopic surface detail invisible to the naked eye, useful for reading inscriptions worn nearly flat by 2,000 years underwater. Unlike Wright's laminography, which produced layered slices, true computed tomography builds a complete three-dimensional digital model of the object's interior, letting researchers digitally rotate, section, and measure every buried gear and inscription without physically touching the fragile bronze at all. For the first time since the mechanism sank to the seafloor around 60 BCE, researchers could see its internal structure whole, rather than guessing at it through decades of partial, conflicting images. The results were announced at an international conference in Athens in November of 2006, and published the same month in the journal Nature. The paper confirmed 30 surviving bronze gears across the recovered fragments, dated the device to toward the end of the 2nd century BCE, and stated plainly that the mechanism is technically more complex than any known device for at least a millennium afterward. Buried inside the fragments, the scans also revealed thousands of individual Greek text characters, tiny inscriptions that had gone completely unread for 2,000 years, hidden inside solid, corroded metal that no previous imaging technique had been able to see through. Stop and hold that contrast for a second. In 1900, a sponge diver spent maybe 5 minutes at the bottom of the sea, wearing a canvas suit and a bronze helmet, hauling up an unremarkable lump by hand. In 2005, an international team funded by a private trust brought custom industrial engineering equipment into a museum lab in Athens to scan that same lump down to the level of individual hand-cut gear teeth. Both moments involve the exact same piece of bronze. A little over a century separates them, and in that gap, an entire discipline of scientific imaging had to be invented just to finish reading what one ancient craftsman had already written. With the 2006 data in hand, researchers could finally describe with real confidence what the front of the mechanism actually did. The front face carried a large dial displaying the zodiac, the 12 constellations the sun appears to move through over the course of a year, layered alongside a corresponding Egyptian calendar ring, letting a user track the sun's position and the calendar date simultaneously on a single face. Behind that dial sat a lunar display, showing the moon's position against the same zodiac background. Thanks to Wright's earlier pin and slot discovery, this lunar pointer didn't just move at a steady, mechanically convenient pace. It sped up and slowed down as it traveled, mimicking the moon's genuinely uneven, real-world motion across the sky, with mechanical accuracy that modern researchers still find impressive. Some reconstructions suggest a small secondary sphere, sometimes described as showing lunar phase, rotated along with this pointer, physically displaying how much of the moon's face would appear lit on any given date. There is also strong evidence, based on gearing ratios found among the fragments, that the front of the mechanism originally included additional dial work modeling the visible motion of the 5 planets known to Hellenistic astronomers, along with the Sun. This is worth stating honestly, rather than glossing over. Very little of that specific planetary gearing physically survives. What we have is largely inferred from surviving gear ratios and the mechanical logic of the rest of the device, which means any reconstruction of the front planetary display remains, to a meaningful degree, an educated and carefully argued guess, rather than a confirmed fact. If the front face made the mechanism impressive, the back face is where it becomes almost unbelievable. 2 large spiral dials dominate the backplate, each one wound through multiple physical turns of the pointer to compress a very long astronomical cycle into a compact, readable space, essentially the ancient equivalent of a scrolling display. The upper spiral tracks the Metonic cycle, a 19-year period discovered independently by Babylonian and Greek astronomers, after which the phases of the moon fall on the same calendar dates again. A smaller subsidiary dial nested within it refines that further against the 76-year Callippic cycle, a longer period correction that keeps the calendar even more precisely aligned over time. The lower spiral is the eclipse predictor, tracking the 223 lunar month Saros cycle, a pattern first understood by Babylonian astronomers centuries earlier, after which the Sun, Moon, and Earth return to a nearly identical arrangement, and eclipses recur in roughly the same sequence. Small engraved glyphs are placed at specific points around this spiral, and 2014 research finally cracked their full meaning, decades after the mechanism's rediscovery. Each glyph indicates whether a predicted eclipse would be lunar or solar, whether it would likely be visible, and roughly what time of day it would occur. A further subsidiary dial, tracking what's called the exeligmos, a triple Saros correction accounting for a leftover third of a day that accumulates across 3 Saros cycles, let a user refine an eclipse prediction down to something closer to the actual time of day rather than just the correct month. There's one more dial worth mentioning, smaller and easy to overlook next to the eclipse mechanism, that tracked a 4-year cycle tied to the Pan-Hellenic Games, including the Olympic festival at Olympia, letting an owner read off which games year the calendar had reached. Researchers have identified, through inscriptions on this dial, month names of specifically Corinthian origin, a detail that has helped scholars narrow down where in the Greek world this specific device might have been built or used. Consider what this actually replaced. Predicting an eclipse using Babylonian-derived arithmetic meant working through layers of written tables and calculation by hand, a process available only to trained specialists with access to the right reference documents. This mechanism collapsed that entire process into turning a single crank and reading a dial. 2,000 years of accumulated Babylonian and Greek astronomical mathematics compressed into interlocking bronze. Here's where this story takes an unusual turn, because there is no clean successor to point to. Normally, in the history of technology, an obsolete machine gets replaced by something newer and better, a clear line of progress you can trace forward. That's not what happened here. Nothing more advanced came along to make the Antikythera mechanism obsolete. As far as the surviving record shows, the entire tradition of building devices like this simply went quiet. For roughly the next 1,400 years, nothing of comparable geared mechanical complexity turns up anywhere in the historical or archaeological record. The next devices that approach this level of sophistication are European mechanical astronomical clocks, starting to appear around the 14th century. That's not a gap caused by a better invention arriving sooner. It's a gap caused, most likely, by the broader contraction of the Hellenistic scientific and manufacturing world that had made a device like this possible in the first place. A slow erosion of institutional knowledge, skilled workshops, and the accumulated expertise needed to design and hand-cut gear trains this precise, spread out across the political and economic upheavals of the following centuries under Roman rule and beyond. It's worth being honest about the limits of what we actually know here, too. We don't have direct evidence explaining exactly why the tradition stopped, only the negative evidence of an unusually long silence in the archaeological record. Ancient writers, including Cicero, describe similar mechanical devices associated with the astronomer Poseidonios, which suggests the Antikythera mechanism likely wasn't a completely unique, one-off creation, but rather the sole physical survivor of what may have been a small, specialized tradition of instrument making. We simply don't have the others. They were likely melted down, lost, or simply never fell into the sea in a way that preserved them for us to find. Derek de Sola Price never got to see his own theory confirmed and corrected by the 2006 tomography results. His major work was published in 1974, and he continued to be recognized as the person who first convinced the scholarly world this device was a genuine calculating machine. But the far clearer picture that later technology would eventually reveal came after his time working on it had ended. Michael Wright kept going. After the 2006 Nature paper validated much of his laminography-era work, while also opening new debates, he continued publishing detailed technical papers and refining his hand-built bronze reconstructions, some of which are considered among the most mechanically faithful working models of the device that exist anywhere. Disagreements between Wright's model and the official Antikythera Mechanism research project's reconstruction on certain gear count and gearing scheme details persisted for years afterward, and in some corners of the research community, mild versions of that disagreement continue today. Tony Freeth, Mike Edmonds, and the wider Antikythera Mechanism research project didn't stop in 2006 either. Their team published further findings in 2008, identifying the previously unknown month names on the Metonic dial, tracing them to Corinthian origin. In 2014, Freeth published research finally decoding the full logic behind the eclipse glyphs on the Saros dial, solving a piece of the puzzle that had remained unresolved even after the major tomography breakthrough. Research into the mechanism's finer details, including ongoing academic disagreement over aspects like the exact planetary gearing and a possible additional lunar cycle called the Draconic cycle, continues into the 2020s. And the wreck itself was never fully excavated. The original 1901 recovery, limited by primitive diving technology, left substantial portions of the ship and its cargo on the seafloor. Jacques Cousteau's team located and dove the site again in 1953 and returned in 1976 for a television expedition. Since 2012, renewed excavations have used modern technology, including a specialized atmospheric diving suit called the exosuit, capable of reaching depths beyond what standard scuba equipment safely allows, to continue searching the site. The working assumption among researchers is straightforward and a little haunting. There may be more of the mechanism still down there, sitting in the dark, waiting for someone to find it, the same way that first sponge diver did, entirely by accident, in a storm, more than a century ago. Today, the 82 known fragments remain at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, displayed alongside modern reconstructed models built from the research described in this video, letting visitors see, side by side, both the corroded original and a working sense of what it once was. Think about the last time your phone quietly reminded you of an event days in advance, or the last time a weather app told you exactly when the moon would be full, or a science app counted down to a solar eclipse happening on the other side of the planet years from now. That quiet confidence, the sense that predicting the sky is just something a small device can do without effort, feels like a distinctly modern convenience. It isn't. That confidence is at least 2,150 years old. Someone in the Hellenistic world, quite possibly on or near the island of Rhodes, built a bronze machine that could do, mechanically, what most people alive today assume only computers can do: take a known set of cycles and turn a hand crank to see the future written out in advance. And then, for reasons we can only partially reconstruct, that entire tradition of building things like it seems to have gone quiet for roughly the next 1,400 years. The unsettling part isn't really the machine itself. It's how close the whole thing came to disappearing completely and permanently. A shipwreck nobody was looking for, a storm that pushed sponge divers off course, a lump of bronze that almost got filed away as unremarkable scrap next to more impressive-looking statues. If that wood casing hadn't happened to crack and reveal gear teeth underneath, there's a real possibility this object would still be sitting in a museum storage room today, uncatalogued as anything special. and we would have no idea that any of this was ever possible at all. So maybe the real lesson isn't about ancient Greek engineering specifically. It's about how much of history might already be sitting somewhere, corroded and unremarkable looking, simply waiting for someone to look closely enough, or for imaging technology good enough, to finally read what's actually inside it. Before wrapping up, it's worth being direct about where the real uncertainty still sits, because a story like this can easily slide into overconfidence if you let it. The front planetary display, the gearing that would have modeled the Sun and 5 known planets moving across the zodiac, is the least physically preserved part of the mechanism. What researchers describe when discussing it is largely a reconstruction built from surviving gear ratios and the internal mechanical logic of the rest of the device, not something read directly off intact surviving parts. It's an educated, carefully argued reconstruction, and most specialists in the field consider it plausible, but it remains, honestly, conjectural rather than confirmed. There's also ongoing academic debate, visible in papers published as recently as the 2020s, over finer mechanical details, whether a fourth lunar cycle, called the Draconic cycle, was represented somewhere in the lost portions of the gearing, and exactly how certain eclipse-related calculations were mechanically implemented. Different research groups have proposed different solutions, and as of now, there isn't universal agreement on every detail. Even the question of exactly who built it and where remains genuinely open. The Corinthian month names found on the Metonic dial, combined with the ship's likely route from Rhodes and the historical association between Poseidonios and similar devices described by Cicero, all point toward plausible answers. None of it amounts to certain proof. This is a rare case in the history of technology where the object survived but a huge amount of the human context around it. Who exactly designed it, who it was built for, whether it was one of many or something closer to unique, simply didn't. If this kind of story pulled you in, the pattern here is worth remembering. Sometimes the most important discoveries in the history of technology don't look impressive at first glance. They look like scrap. They sit in storage for years before anyone realizes what they actually are. Subscribe if you want more of these forgotten technology deep dives, because there are plenty of others like this one, still waiting to be told properly. And in the comments, tell me specifically what forgotten object or lost technology you think deserves this same kind of deep dive treatment next. Not just ancient technology in general, something specific. Roman concrete that has outlasted modern concrete by centuries. The so-called Baghdad battery. Greek fire, the weaponized incendiary whose exact recipe was lost and never fully recovered. Give me a name, and if enough of you land on the same one, that's the next video. If you made it this far, do me a favor and hit like before you go. It genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next deep dive.